I thought it would be a normal dinner party. Then I realized who the main course was. Written by Outside Your Window. The thing about Jake and Kate is that, like most couples my age, they tend to tell too long of stories. I know this is a minor inconvenience, but after a while, it starts to get irritating. I think they picked it up from Florence, my ex-fiancée. She told the longest stories. When our friend group first got together, she convinced everyone that we should be the kind of adults who had dinner parties and told very long stories. I think she thought that made us look smarter. Everyone played along, but I refused to. I keep my stories brief. But on the night of our most recent dinner party, Jake and Kate didn't tell any stories at all. Jake looked happy, but only because he kept smiling at me. As for Kate, she was a wreck. Her socks were mismatched, her hair all out of place, and she kept checking the time and announcing it to the room, even though no one asked. The other couple in attendance was Mitch and Millie. They didn't tell long stories, but they also rarely talked. For most of our dinner parties, they would show up, eat, stare into their respective corners of the room, then leave without hugging anybody. When they walked in, they hugged me first. I don't know if they were trying to make it less awkward that I was the only single person here, but it just made me sad, like I was the last dog at the pound. "You look handsome," Millie said, inspecting my outfit. I was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, very fashionable. "A real lady killer," Mike said, then squeezed my shoulder. After our awkward hellos, we took our seats around the table. Kate put out plates and fancy napkins as Jake dropped the entrees in the center. There was charred asparagus, mashed potatoes, garlic bread, red wine, white wine, shots of whiskey, pitas, steamed broccoli, tubs of gravy and hot sauce, and a quiche. The last item was a silver platter covered with a dome. Jake waited to put that down last. When he finally did, he lifted the cover and the scent filled the room. The pig's torso was in the center, white and crispy. All around it was the chopped up meat drizzled with barbecue sauce. "Okay," he said, his voice shaking a little. "Let's eat." Before I knew it, I was full, painfully full. As we each surrendered, we tossed in our napkins and let out a big sigh. It became a bit of a joke between me, Mitch, and Millie. Jake and Kate didn't participate. They still seemed off. The awkwardness, of course, made sense. It was our first dinner party since the wedding. Once we were all finished, Jake raised a glass and clinked it with a fork. "I just wanted to say thank you all for coming over," he said. "Well, thanks for having us," I said, desperate to fill the quiet. Jake took a breath, then looked at Kate. It looked like he was trying to signal something, but she didn't notice. I think she was on her fourth glass of wine. He turned his attention back to the group. "I know that after our wedding, things got a little weird," he said. "I know it was tense and awkward, and maybe not the best event you've been to." "I loved the Italian cookies," Millie said. "And the filet," Mitch offered. "Thank you," Jake said. "But we know there was more to the night than the food." "Oh, I mean," Mike said, then took a swig of wine. "Honey," Millie said, putting her hand on his arm. "It's okay. She attacked you." My heart fluttered a bit. I could feel my face getting red, but I kept my focus on the pig torso. The ribs looked different than other pigs I'd seen before, maybe a little thinner. "Florence was definitely in the wrong," Jake said. "I think we can all agree on that. Right, Robert?" Jake looked at me. I nodded. "Sure, yeah," I said. "She was out of line." I had run through the details every night since it happened. I didn't want to think about it again, but I couldn't help myself. Florence and I were fighting. She said I wasn't showing her enough affection. Then I said I wasn't one for PDA. Then she accused me of not loving her. Then, when a slow song came on, she charged the dance floor and grabbed Mitch's hand. Millie was at her table, talking to her friend. Florence and Mitch started dancing. Both of them could have stopped it, but it just kept going. First, it looked like a joke. Then, Florence pressed her body into his. Mitch grabbed the small of her back. Their faces moved closer together. Inches turned into 1 inch, then centimeters, then... Next thing I knew, Florence was on the dance floor. Millie was standing over her, her leg flying up, then dropping down onto Florence's face. I ran over, but by the time I got there, the fight was over. The music stopped. Florence and Millie were screaming at each other. Then Florence and I were gone. I didn't think to check her head. I was confused and angry and sad. She'd never cheated on me before, to my knowledge. But now I was seeing her so clearly. The next morning, she woke up with a bad headache. She could barely talk. I took her to the emergency room. There was some internal bleeding in her skull. They rushed her into surgery that same day. It was successful, but astronomically expensive. Eventually, she made a full recovery, which I guess was a good thing. As a courtesy, I waited until she was 100% to call off the engagement. When I said that, she called me a coward, then was completely moved out of our apartment a day later. Anyway, Jake said, bringing me back to the present. There has been a... Jake looked to Kate for help. She shrugged, then took a swig of wine. A predicament, Jake said. The word stayed in the air for a moment. Eventually, Michelle broke the silence. What do you mean, a predicament? Jake placed his glass on the table and stood. For a moment, it looked like he was going to cry. Florence, she came over this morning, Jake said. A hush fell over the already hushed room. She what? Mitch asked. Jake looked at Kate one more time. She nodded, ever so slightly, as if to grant him permission. Jake looked back at us. She wanted $100,000, Jake said, or she would sue us for a lot more. We served the alcohol at the wedding. She tried to argue that she was overserved and her injury was a result of that. She said she talked to lawyers who said she could be a millionaire off this. Plus, we just got that money from Kate's mom's estate. It would be horrible for us. Florence said this? I asked. A part of me figured she would go to me first. Maybe I never really knew her at all. What did you say? Millie asked. Her face had gone pale. Well, Jake said, I didn't take it so well, as you can imagine. I invited her in, of course, hoping we could talk this out. People change with head injuries, Kate said. They become aggressive. Things took a turn, Jake said. A turn? Michelle asked. I started to feel off, a little nauseous. My stomach turned, the lights seemed brighter. I gotta use the restroom, I said, suppressing a gag. As I stood up, Jake put his hand on my shoulder and pushed me back down. Things are going to move quite fast, Jake said, and in my opinion, it is best we work together on this. Mitch and Millie, you are going to be questioned with the whole wedding thing. And as for you, Jake looked at me. You might be the prime suspect, he said. It's always the ex. That's true, Kate said. What? What are you saying? Millie asked, then began to cry. You don't have to know the details if you don't want to, Jake said. But we are all involved now. Every decision we make must be the interest of keeping us all out of jail. United front, that's our best chance. What are you talking about? I asked. I suppressed another gag. This meal was not sitting right with me at all. Where is Florence? Mitch asked. Jake looked at us, then down at the silver platter. I looked at it too. The more I looked at the ribs, the less pig-like they seemed. He pressed his lips together. Jake, I said, please, just Tell us what. Before I could finish, I vomited onto the table. Mitch and Millie were too stunned to notice. Their expressions had gone limp. The good news, Jake said, is that hiding the body is usually the hardest part. Now, we just need to work on our alibis.